You are pressed against cold stone in a darkened corridor, heart hammering in your chest, watching through a crack in the wooden door as your parents whisper urgently in the bedchamber beyond. But they are not arguing. They are not fighting. Your mother's hand finds your father's beneath the blanket, her fingers tracing patterns on his palm. A language you cannot understand but somehow recognize as sacred. Your grandmother shifts on her pallet 3 feet away, her eyes closed but her breathing too deliberate, too controlled. She is pretending to sleep. Everyone is pretending. This is the great performance of medieval intimacy, the collective agreement to unsee what cannot be avoided, to unhear what echoes in a room barely larger than a modern closet, to preserve the fiction of privacy in a world built entirely without it. Before we go deeper into how love survived under these impossible conditions, I'd be honored to know where you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that we can explore these intimate human struggles together, connected across centuries and continents by our shared curiosity about how people truly lived. This is England in the mid-14th century, though it could be any corner of medieval Europe from Andalusia to the frozen reaches of Scandinavia. The specific cottage we're entering sits in Yorkshire. The year is 1347, and within its drafty stone walls live 8 souls spanning 3 generations. There is no word in their vocabulary for privacy. The concept would be as incomprehensible as electricity or democracy. Yet somehow, within this suffocating proximity, couples fell in love, sustained marriages, conceived children, and created bonds strong enough to endure plagues, famines, and wars. The question that haunts historians is not whether they managed intimacy under these conditions, but how, and what that reveals about the very nature of human connection. The architecture itself was a declaration of communal existence. Archaeological excavations of 13th and 14th century peasant dwellings across England reveal structures typically measuring 12 to 15 feet across. Within this space lived not just the nuclear family but parents, unmarried siblings, elderly relatives, and during harvest season, hired laborers who slept on the floor near the door. The hearth occupied the center, its smoke curling upward through a hole in the thatched roof, its warmth the gravitational center around which all life orbited. There was one room, one fire, one reality that could not be escaped. But the absence of physical privacy did not mean the absence of boundaries. Medieval couples developed something far more sophisticated, a network of silent signals, coded language, and carefully choreographed routines that created psychological privacy in a space where walls could not. A wife named Margaret Paston, whose letters from 1440s Norfolk miraculously survived, wrote to her sister describing what she called the language of the hearth. When her husband mentioned checking the grain stores at night, it was not about grain. When he adjusted the firewood in a particular way, it signaled his intentions for later that evening. When she began mending by candlelight instead of joining the family conversation, she was answering him. These were not crude signals. They were poetry, the entire vocabulary of love expressed through the mundane rituals of medieval life. The bed itself was the most valuable possession most families owned, second only to their plow or loom. It was not a place of luxury, but of survival, built high off the ground to avoid the rats and drafts that could kill you in winter. The mattress was straw, or wool, or rags, covered in whatever fabric they could afford, often shared by multiple family members. Yet within this utilitarian object, couples had to find not just rest, but tenderness. Church doctrine added layers of complexity that would seem absurd to modern sensibilities. Sexual relations were forbidden on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Forbidden during Advent, Lent, and the 40 days following childbirth. Forbidden during a woman's menstrual period, during pregnancy once it became visible, and during any of the dozens of feast days and fast days that crowded the medieval calendar. By the time the church finished listing prohibitions, married couples were left with perhaps 100 nights per year when intimacy was spiritually permissible. And yet births did not decline. Marriages did not collapse. Love, it seemed, was more defiant than doctrine. The key was timing. Not the hours the church allowed, but the moments life created. Spring offered the first opportunities. As the weather warmed and days lengthened, couples could slip away to check on distant fields or gather herbs in the forest. These excursions carried risks, bandits, wild animals, the ever-present threat of gossip, but they offered something invaluable: the illusion of being alone under an open sky. A shepherd named Thomas, whose testimony appears in a 1320 church court record from Montaillou, described meeting his wife in a clearing halfway between their village and the summer pastures. They would sit back to back, he said, not even touching, and talk for an hour about their hopes for their children, their fears about the harvest, the small kindnesses and frustrations of their daily life. That, he insisted, was their truest intimacy. Not the brief couplings in their crowded cottage, but these stolen conversations where no one could overhear. Summer brought its own rhythm of opportunity and constraint. The fields required constant attention, but the heat of midday drove others to seek shade while hardy couples remained, their labor a cover for proximity. Harvest season, paradoxically, was the worst time for intimacy. Extra workers crowded into already tight spaces, everyone collapsed from exhaustion, and the pressure to gather crops before weather turned made every moment precious. But after harvest came the autumn festivals, brief explosions of communal joy where dancing, drinking, and celebration created a kind of sanctioned chaos in which normal social rules loosened. Couples could touch more openly, laugh more freely, express affection that would draw suspicious glances on an ordinary day. Winter was the cruelest season for medieval intimacy. The cold that made shared body heat necessary also made undressing dangerous. Multiple layers of wool and linen, worn continuously for weeks, could not be removed without risking hypothermia. Couples learned to find connection through the thickness of fabric, their intimacy constrained to whispered words, and the pressure of bodies pressed together more for survival than romance. The darkness came early and stayed late, compressing all household activity into a few hours around the fire. Privacy was impossible, but in that impossibility, something unexpected emerged: a collective pretense, an unspoken agreement among family members to grant each other the dignity of ignored intimacy. A German monastery chronicle from 1340 describes this phenomenon with surprising candor. The chronicler, interviewing peasant families about their living conditions, recorded one wife explaining, "We learn not to see. My mother-in-law, she learned not to see from her mother-in-law. I will teach my daughter not to see. This is how families survive." It was not privacy, but it was something. A gift of selective blindness, freely given and never acknowledged. Children posed the greatest challenge. Young ones could be distracted or would sleep through anything. But adolescents, aware and curious, required more delicate management. The solution was education through silence. Children learned by observation that certain sounds, certain movements in the night, were to be ignored. They learned to breathe deeply and evenly, feigning sleep, granting their parents the mercy of plausible deniability. It was a collective performance in which everyone played their role, never discussed, never acknowledged, but absolutely essential. The Church's role in medieval intimacy extended far beyond prohibition. Confession required married couples to describe their intimate lives to priests, creating a surveillance system that penetrated even the marriage bed. Penitential manuals from the period provide startlingly specific guidance on acceptable positions, appropriate frequency, and permissible pleasure. Some historians argue this was oppressive control. Others suggest it provided a framework that helped couples navigate desire within moral bounds. The truth, as always, was probably both. But there was also an underground network, a feminine knowledge system that operated in whispered conversations between women. Midwives possessed detailed understanding of female anatomy, conception, and contraception. They shared techniques for timing intercourse to avoid pregnancy, herbal remedies to prevent implantation, and methods to end early pregnancies. This knowledge was carefully guarded, passed from mother to daughter, midwife to patient, always in private, always with the understanding that official doctrine condemned it even as practical necessity demanded it. The letters of Margaret Paston, Eleanor de Montfort, and other noblewomen who had access to literacy reveal sophisticated thinking about intimate relationships. They discuss love, desire, frustration, and longing with remarkable candor, though always in coded language. Margaret writes to her husband about visiting the South Chamber, which scholars believe was euphemism for intimacy. Eleanor writes about the garden work that requires her husband's attention. These women lived in slightly larger homes than peasants, but they faced the same essential challenge: maintaining intimate marriages in spaces crowded with family, servants, and constant observation. Pilgrimage offered unique opportunities for intimacy. The journey to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Jerusalem required weeks or months of travel during which couples experienced unprecedented freedom from social oversight. They slept in wayside inns with other pilgrims, certainly, but the anonymity of travel created possibilities impossible in their home villages. A remarkable letter from 1324, preserved in Canterbury Cathedral archives, describes a wife's perspective. On the road, we are no one's son or daughter, no one's mother or father. We are only ourselves, and in that we find each other anew. The physical realities of medieval bodies added another layer of complexity. Bathing was rare, perhaps monthly for the wealthy, less often for the poor. Clothing served as both day wear and night wear, rarely washed. Teeth rotted, breath stank, bodies harbored lice and fleas. Yet within this reality, couples still found each other desirable. Modern sensibilities might recoil, but medieval people knew no different standard. The smell of your spouse was simply the smell of human, and familiarity bred not contempt but comfort. Food played an unexpected role in medieval intimacy. In a world where hunger was constant, the sharing of special foods became a love language. A husband who brought home honey or rare spices, a wife who saved the choice portion of meat for her spouse. These were profound expressions of affection. The preparation of food, too, offered opportunities for intimate service. Helping each other eat, sharing a cup of ale, feeding a sick spouse during illness, these acts of care were both practical necessities and tender rituals. The medieval understanding of conception, that female pleasure was necessary for pregnancy, created unique pressures and opportunities. It meant husbands had theological justification to ensure their wives' satisfaction. But it also created anxiety and expectation around intimate encounters, particularly when conception failed to occur. Infertility was devastating in medieval marriages, not just emotionally but economically and socially. The inability to produce children threatened inheritance, alliances, and a couple's standing in the community. What's most striking in the historical record is not the obstacles medieval couples faced, but their creativity in overcoming them. They developed touch languages that could communicate affection in full view of family members, a certain way of passing a bowl, a particular pattern traced on a hand, a gesture that looked ordinary but carried private meaning. They learned to find intimacy not just in physical union, but in the accumulation of small moments, shared glances across the hearth, whispered conversations while working side by side, the comfort of familiar presence in a dangerous world. The Black Death, arriving in England in 1348, transformed everything. Within 2 years, perhaps half the population was dead. Survivors found themselves with more space, more resources, and less oversight. The cramped households that had defined medieval intimacy for centuries suddenly emptied. A cottage that once held 8 people might now hold 3. The psychological impact was profound. A generation that had never known physical privacy suddenly had rooms to themselves. But the change came too late for most. For centuries of medieval couples who loved and lived and died in those crowded cottages, intimacy was something they had to steal, negotiate, and defend. It was not a right, but an achievement. Not a given, but a gift they gave each other through ingenuity, patience, and stubborn determination. The archaeological record offers one final, haunting detail. In excavations of medieval cottage sites across Europe, researchers consistently find small objects hidden in the walls or buried beneath hearthstones. A carved wooden token, a pressed flower, a piece of cloth embroidered with initials. These were not valuable enough to hide for security. They were intimate objects, secreted away in the only private spaces medieval couples possessed: the gaps between stones, the shadows beneath floors, the hidden pockets of a shared world. And so we return to that Yorkshire cottage in 1347, to the couple lying beneath rough wool blankets while family members sleep 3 feet away in every direction. We understand now that their intimacy was not diminished by the lack of privacy, but refined by it. They learned to love not despite the watching eyes, but through them, creating a bond that required not isolation, but intention, not walls, but will. The medieval lesson was this: intimacy is not about the space you control, but about the understanding you build. It lives not in locked doors and empty rooms, but in the choice to be vulnerable before witnesses, to whisper secrets everyone can hear, but only lovers understand. To find the sacred in stolen moments that the world conspires to deny you. They had nothing we would recognize as privacy, and yet they had everything we would recognize as love, tested, proven, and preserved through conditions that would break most modern relationships within a week. Their intimacy was forged in the crucible of impossibility, and perhaps that is why it endured. The wind still howls through gaps in the timber walls. The fire dies to embers. 8 souls breathe in the darkness of one small room, and beneath the blankets, 2 hands find each other, hold tight, and refuse to let go.